Hi, I'm Dr. Craig Jalquist. Permission to be joyful. What might that mean, and why would we need permission? Don't we just be joyful? No. A lot of us don't. Um, so, for this, I want to talk a little about what it is that kills joy, that flattens joy, that puts it out of action. And what I'm going to mention works both inside of us and outside. So, there's people who do these things, and then through internalization, we start doing them to ourselves. Some of this is things we learned in our families of origin, some of it we learned elsewhere. But I want to go through a list of what I call internalized joy killings, and then talk about what we can do about this. Actually, I'll talk about that as we go, because this can be handled, and I want you to be able to really step into your own joy when it happens and enjoy it. So here we go. So there oftentimes we grow up in families where there's a family member who is suffering. They might be physically ill, they might be mentally ill, have some sort of a long-term injury or what have you. And of course, that all by itself doesn't kill joy. But sometimes what we tell ourselves about it does. So an example would be when there's somebody in the family who is suffering, and then we learn not to step into our own joy, to express our own joy when it overtakes us. And sometimes the thought is, who am I to be joyful when this is happening? What are they going to think? Because they're suffering so much, and here I am, and I'm all happy and cheerful and all that. So sometimes we take down the level of joy to the point where we actually don't feel it anymore out of loyalty to somebody in the family. Now, as a former family therapist, I can tell you that this tends to go down through the generations. It might feel like your own strategy, but if you take a very careful look at the generations who came before you, you'll see similar movements, similar joy-killing movements among other people as well. So this is often a family issue as much as it is an individual issue. And so by dealing with it, you become the member of the family through all the generations who finally resolves this. And sometimes it's as simple as recognizing what's going on and realizing me being miserable doesn't help somebody else who already is miserable. In fact, being around somebody who at least occasionally feels joy might actually be good for them. So that's an important thing to realize, because we all come from families where somebody is hurting. There's always somebody who's hurting in a family, if not in our generation, then in a previous one. So joy is it's like a shining light in the darkness of the family's pain. And so in a sense, we have an obligation not to put that light out. So our next one is, it's somewhat different. It comes from a sense of envy, and it's certainly not restricted to families. You see it at work and relationships and all that. What this looks like is whether you're doing it to someone else or let's put it in this term, like having it done to you. So you're in a great mood, you're having a peak experience, something really wonderful that's just happened to you, and you share this with somebody and they diminish it. They go, that's nice. Or they say, you only feel that way because, right? The flattening because. William James, the philosopher psychologist, called this the nothing but. Or you're in full on in the excitement of a good experience, and someone says, "Did you take out the trash today?" So what's happening with this? What the other person is experiencing is envy, because there's something hurting them. There's something that wounds them somehow. And it could just be the fact that they don't feel joy. Maybe they're depressed. Maybe they're flat. So they feel a little bit better about themselves by diminishing your joy. It's a very sad dynamic. So it's important when you see that happening more than once to be selective about who you share your joys with, because you want to share them with people who go, wow, that's great, or at least lift you up and support you somehow, so that you feel even better telling them about what's making you joyful. So it can be handy to have a mental list of, okay, don't tell this person, don't tell that person, because you know they're going to crap on it. But I will tell these people because they're going to cheer me on. So that can come in handy. It's closely related, and by the way, these overlap. There can be more than one happening at once. But closely related is cynicism, which often is a spoiler all by itself. And cynicism is a defense of the broken heart. And what's happening, and it's also fear-based. So what's happening with people who are cynical about anything that looks joyful is probably sometime earlier in their life, they were full of joy themselves. Maybe even as far back as infancy, toddlerhood, whatever. And somebody hurt them because of it. Somebody spoiled it for them, or knocked them down for it, or even abused them. So their fear, which sometimes they're not even conscious of, is that if there's anything joyful going on with them or with somebody else, it'll go away. It'll be taken away. And then they'll re-experience all the hurt that they felt before. So it's safer for them, according to this way of thinking anyway, they believe it's safer for them to just not have anything to do with it. So, which is also a very sad psychology. And so realizing that about cynical people, similar way of dealing with it in terms of spoiling people, which is to just not share it in a way, you can share the events, but don't share it in a way that you expect any support, right? And that's something to look at. If you're continually getting flattened in your enthusiasms by somebody who's cynical or spoiling, then it's time to turn inward and say, why am I setting myself up like this? Do I have this fantasy that someday I'm going to be able to share this joy with them and they're going to be happy? Because it won't happen that way, right? They may go through some sort of a transformation and come to a different place, but it won't be because you share joys with them. So that's something important to look at, why you keep doing that. Now, closely related to cynicism is something that I refer to as the lure of the abyss. And as Virgil pointed out long ago, it's much easier to get to the underworld than it is to get out of it. So if we think of underworld as a permanent state of injury, or a state of dark confusion, or some kind of bewilderment, depression, just being down, right? It's an interesting word, down, because in this case, down in the underworld. When we think about it that way, people can get used to being in the underworld. You can live there for years, but the problem is you start turning into an underworld figure. You start becoming a bit like Hades, or one of those gods who live down there, or one of those spirits like Thanatos who drags the bodies around. And after a while, you lose your capacity for joy and light and brightness and all of those associated feelings. And this too is a safety move, because when you're in the underworld all the time, things can't get any worse. Whereas if you allow yourself to embrace your joy, it can be taken away from you. So self-protection is one of the reasons that people stay in the underworld. And if you're doing that, then the quest becomes, how do I get out of here? How do I get out of the underworld and regain the courage to have happy, cheerful experiences, whether or not they vanish? And ultimately, they all do. They're all transitory, right? So lure of the abyss. Another thing that comes up is guilt. This is mostly an internal one. So the logic here is, why should I deserve to feel joy? Because I've done these harmful things. So at that point, it becomes necessary to address the guilt. And it's kind of a sad legacy of some forms of religious education, by no means all, that tell us that guilt has to be made up for. That when we hurt other people, then we have to somehow make things right. Now, the impulse to repair things is a good one, and we should try to repair things. But there are some forms of injury that can't be repaired. And so when we've done our best to make up for what we've done, that becomes the moment when we need to let it go. And so self-punishment by not being joyful because of things that you've done is a very bitter circle to be in. And it's ultimately futile because you will never reach a point of punishing yourself enough that you go, okay, that's good. Now I'm done. Now I can feel joyful. You'll never get there. You have to dump the whole dynamic. The whole reasoning is out of kilter, right? And it's to your credit that you feel guilty about things that you've done. That's an appropriate reaction to hurting other people, whether it's emotionally hurting them or physically or what have you. And I've seen this dynamic often. I've worked with men who committed terrible acts of violence to individuals, to groups, you name it. And it's very hard for them when they want to turn over another leaf because they've got all those harm, all those deaths, whatever it is, on their conscience. And nothing is going to change that. That's part of the realization here is to say, I can't make up for this. All I can do is realize that an earlier form of myself did things that the current me would never approve of, and I have to move on. It doesn't help me not to be able to experience any joy or happiness in my life by way of self-punishment, because that never ends. Self-punishment is a demon, and it needs to be cast out. So another killer of joy is distractions, just not leaving enough room in life to experience joy. Usually when we do that, it's because we're running away from other feelings like sadness or anger or other things that are unpleasant to actually let in. But the thing about emotions is when you repress one, when you think you repress one, you're actually damaging your capacity to feel emotions. It's sort of like putting your eye out so that you don't have to see the color red. You destroy your vision. And so with the full range of emotions, including joy, comes the obligation to experience the full range. We can't really pick and choose which ones we experience and which stay away. So distraction is our way sometimes of trying to protect ourselves against the feelings that are not joyful. But it's a package deal. Let's see what else. A couple more of these. This goes parallel with cynicism. Sometimes people are just disenchanted and disheartened, and that's from a broken heart. They've been terribly disappointed. They put their faith in something, and it didn't turn out the way that they expected. There's a lot of forms this can take. It could be betrayal by friends or relationship partners or family members. It could be that, and I've done this one, you spend years in a certain institution working for them, trying to make them a stronger place, and then you get stabbed in the back, right? Very disheartening and disenchanting. So the work there is to repair the broken heart, to move on, to sit with ouch and the betrayal that comes with it and the anger and other feelings, and then allow them space to complete themselves, and then you can go in a different direction and be more joyful as well. Sometimes, I'm going to use the word reformers to cover a pretty broad range. So reformers sometimes include activists, sometimes they include political advocates. Some reformers are people within a religious organization, some in a political one, but these are the people who are trying to change the world for the better. And some of them feel, and it's understandable, that what they need to do to wake us all up is to shame us and flood us with rivers of unpleasant facts. I often think of advocates and activists who are trying to wake us up to global warming, which at this point, if you're not awake to, I should call it climate chaos, that's a more accurate term. If you're not awake to that, you're not going to be anyway. So why bother, right? You can't wake people up unless they want to be, unless they're in a state where they're ready to be. So what this looks like oftentimes is, in terms of joy, is that those of us who have work to do in the world and want to bring a sense of joy and happiness get shot down by the reformers. And the idea is something like, no, this work is hard, it's desperate, we're in an emergency, and all that, right? Well, even in an emergency, people should celebrate. Even in an emergency, people should be in touch with their joy. Maybe more in an emergency than when business as usual, right? So, not allowing these voices of alarm to talk you out of your feeling of joy. I've run into this a few times, not just with the joy, but I have this kind of permanent sense that not that things will work out because they're falling apart right now, but and a lot of people are being harmed. People, animals, whole regions, whole ecosystems, in terms of climate chaos, which is one of multiple problems our species is facing. So, it's not that I come from a happy ever after place, but I do have this basic intuition that I've had for a long time now, that the ultimate trajectory of our species is going to be in a good direction. We have a lot of suffering to do first, and there's going to be a lot of death ahead of us. But ultimately, the feeling that I have is it's hard to put into words. It's not joy, but it's more like a certainty that things will be okay on an intuitive level. I don't offer it for proof. Maybe it's just for me to feel, but that's where I come from. And so sometimes I've bumped into people who want to scare me with facts and figures and depressing news, and I just think, well, that's your path, you know. Maybe you're talking to yourself more than me, but allowing yourself permission to be joyful. I forget which countries they were in South America, but at one time during Civil War situations, there were women who went around creating these organizations, not just for resilience and supporting people and meeting basic needs, all of which is absolutely vital, but also to create joy. And I always thought that was a good idea. So let's do two more of these. One of them is martyrdom. And so sometimes people get into a martyr role, and it's very dramatic, and they're often very passive aggressive, and they will try to squash your joy. It's a form of spoiling, really. They will try to squash your joy because they're unhappy. So there's a distinction here that's important, which is there's a lot of people that are legitimately unhappy, and they are injured emotionally or physically. They might have had horrible circumstances happen to them. And so in no way should we forget that or diminish their pain or disparage their pain. That's what their lot is right now. And if anything, we should support them. But what I'm talking about is martyrdom as a role, as a passive-aggressive way of manipulating other people into feeling guilty or reluctant or whatever it is when they have joy in their lives. So that's something we can't permit. And again, as is so often the case, to submit to this and to eradicate our joy doesn't help them. Manipulators don't get better by having you play their game, right? And sometimes you need to confront it, which I have many times, both as a therapist and in my own family, and occasionally in relationships too. So when you see someone stuck in the martyr role, sometimes the best response is to say, I'm sorry you're so unhappy, and leave it. You can't fix them. You can't rescue them. It'll just make you miserable. They have to come to terms with it. So the most you can do is be a supportive friend or family member and not let them rain on you all the time. And then lastly, I want to mention people who are addicted to practicality. And these are the people who say, I think of Scrooge in this context and his partner, Jacob Marley. These are the people who say, what good is it if it doesn't pay the bills? What good is it if it doesn't have revenue attached to it, right? So there's all sorts of stuff underneath that I won't go into. It would take too much time. But the thing here is there's a couple of ways of dealing with this. One is just recognizing and seeing through this sort of addiction, because that's what it is. In A Christmas Carol, Dickens' work, he has the ex-partner of Scrooge, who's leaving him because of this, say to him that basically your object of worship is gain with a capital G. That's what you're about, right? And so she leaves. She doesn't want to put up with it. And part of her sadness is that she sees that he's more than that. That there's more to him, that he actually has a heart underneath all that. So people who are addicted to practicality aren't necessarily like Scrooge, in being that mean and that cold-hearted. But sometimes with the best of intentions, they'll want it measurable. They'll want it profitable. And oftentimes they've been through poverty themselves, or their families have. And they're worried because they think you're drifting off into some impractical pie-in-the-sky state of mind, and they want to make sure you take care of yourself. So that's sometimes where this comes from. So a couple of ways of dealing with this. So one is you can speak their language and make the practical argument, do a little research and say, well, when you feel joy, it's physically healthy, it gets your brain moving, it does this, it does that, whatever, So answering their own argument. It probably won't change their mind, though, because there are emotional reasons why we hold to these attitudes, right? And another thing is just to thank them and say, well, I hear that you're concerned about me. Thanks. I'm not concerned about me, and I'm going to continue to feel joyful. So now I want to mention, too, a couple other things here, and then I want to leave you with a quotation by Hermann Hesse about this. Joy is often accompanied by enchantment, awe, wonder. It's really, it's a natural state, and it's the right of everyone to be able to feel joyful. So if you're not feeling joyful somewhere in your life, at least occasionally, something's wrong with your life, to be blunt, okay? We all should be able to feel joyful at some time or another, even when circumstances are difficult and we're facing a lot of pressure. There still should be room for joy to shine its way in through the cracks of all of that difficulty. So not being able to feel joy is a wake-up. It's time for a life examination, a really honest one. So that's a recommendation I would make. And a spiritual self-examination is part of that. They're the same, actually. To live the spiritual life is also to live a life not constantly in joy. That would get old probably, but at least open to it. It's an expression of aliveness. Joy shows enthusiasm for the world, that you're glad to be here. It's deeper than happiness, and like happiness, it probably doesn't work too well to pursue it for its own sake. I think it's better to accept it as a gift. It's a gift of the Spirit. Sometimes it comes to you in a dark time. Sometimes it comes to you when you're feeling okay, and then all of a sudden you're filled with joy. And so at such times, maybe a good way of being receptive is to begin with the thought of thank you. Thank you for giving me this gift of Spirit. So I want to read you a bit of a quotation by Hesse. And it took him 10 or 11 years to write his last novel, The Glass Bead Game. And it's been published in the U.S. As Magister Ludi. But in The Glass Bead Game, there's a character named Joseph Necht, whose last name actually means to serve. It's similar to the English word knight. And so throughout Hesse's novels, there's almost always a character who's striving for self-realization and for spiritual consciousness. And so in this last novel of Hesse's, Joseph Necht is the latest version of that, and he succeeds. And he becomes the head of an organization called Castalia, which has a mythic name. It's named after the spring where the muses like to hang out. And it's an organization dedicated to things of culture and the spirit. And so he has a friend named De Signori who is suffering a lot. He's been through a lot. He's very sad. He's worried about his son who's acting out a lot. And so after a lengthy conversation, what I want to read you is part of Joseph Necht's response to the sadness of De Signori, and I'll leave you with that. So, one other thing too. In this passage, I don't know what the German word is, but it's translated as cheerful serenity. So we could think of that as a kind of, not an ecstatic joy perhaps, but as that calm joy, that contentment that comes to us sometimes. I think it works for all kinds of joy. But there's also a word in German, Glück, which Glück means, it can mean different things like good fortune, happiness, and all that. It may have been that word that got translated. But in any case, when you hear cheerful serenity, think about what we just talked about in terms of joy. So this is Joseph Necht to his friend De Signori. I would like to say something more to you about cheerful serenity, the serenity of the stars and of the mind. You are averse to serenity, presumably because you've had to walk the ways of sadness. And now all brightness and good cheer strikes you as shallow and childish, and cowardly to boot, a flight from the terrors and abysses. But, my dear devotee of sadness, even though for some this may well be a flight, all this would not lessen the value and splendor of genuine serenity, the serenity of the sky and the mind. Granted, there are those among us who are too easily satisfied, who enjoy a sham serenity, but in contrast to them, we also have generations of men whose serenity is not playful shallowness, but earnest depth. To achieve this cheerful serenity is to me and many others the finest and highest of goals. Such cheerfulness is neither frivolity nor complacency. It is supreme insight and love, affirmation of all reality, alertness on the brink of all depths and abysses. It is a virtue of saints and of knights. It is indestructible and only increases with age and nearness to death. It is the secret of beauty and the real substance of all art. The poet, who praises the splendors and terrors of life in the dance measures of his verse, the musician who sounds them in a pure eternal present, these are bringers of light, increasers of joy and brightness on earth, even if they lead us first through tears and stress. Perhaps the poet whose verses gladden us was a sad solitary, and the musician was a melancholy dreamer. But even so, their work shares in the cheerful serenity of the gods and the stars. What they give us is no longer their darkness, their suffering or fears, but a drop of pure light, eternal cheerfulness. This kind of serenity, this kind of cheerful serenity is what I have been concerned with ever since I began dimly to sense its meaning during my student days, and I shall never again relinquish it, not even in unhappiness and suffering. May the week bring you blessings.